Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the Pharmacy Cannabis Lecture Series. Each session is designed to deliver a small and in-depth dose of cannabis education. I'm Candace Hawes, and I want to thank all of our viewers and our customers for joining us from the Pharmacy Santa Ana, Santa Barbara, Berkeley, and the Pottery in Los Angeles. In this session today, we're going to discuss the long history of medical cannabis in honor of the 25-year anniversary of Prop 215. It's amazing to think back to 1996 and all the struggles that the patients and caregivers went through for many, many, many years. It's important as cannabis consumers that as we celebrate this 25-year anniversary, that we take this time to look back and to honor those that have paved our way to freedom, to access, and the variety that we have today. It's also important on this anniversary to take time to learn about the roots of medical cannabis and educate people on the fact that this plant has been on the earth as long as man. As we celebrate this anniversary, I think it's very fitting to have one of the most longstanding and prestigious physicians in the field to deliver a presentation. In the early days of medical cannabis, the 1996 to the early 2000s, there were very few doctors who risked their licenses to provide medical cannabis recommendations to patients in need. Dr. Bearman was one of the first in our state and still one of the last great doctors that we have. In his 40-year career, Dr. Bearman worked in public health, administrative medicine, primary care, pain management, and cannabinoid. Before working in the cannabis field, Dr. Bearman worked in the drug abuse and treatment field, including serving as the co-director of the Haight-Ashbury Drug Treatment Program, being a member of Governor Reagan's Interagency Task Force on Drug Abuse, and member of both the Santa Barbara and San Diego Drug Abuse Technical Advisory Committees. And he was also a consultant to Hoffman LaRoche, Santa Barbara County Schools, and the National PTA. Dr. Bearman currently serves as the Vice President at the American Academy of Cannabinoid Medicine, and he's been recognized by Santa Barbara Medical Society with the Humanitarian Recognition Award. He's also the author of several books on history and the use of medical cannabis, Cannabis as Medicine, A Guide to Practical Cannabinoid Medicine, and Drugs Are Not the Devil's Tool. Dr. Bearman is also featured in the documentary Medical Cannabis and its impact on human health. For all the reasons above, I'm a huge supporter of his work, and I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Bearman to be our speaker today.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. It's hard to believe that I've accomplished that much, but then again, I've been around for a heck of a long time. So let's, you got my email address there, davidbearman@cox.net. I'm glad to answer your questions. I'm even happier to sell you some of my books. One of the things is important is to understand the endocannabinoid system because it's the largest neurotransmitter system in the human body. Now, we're not going to talk about that in any depth today, but it's important for health and illness for you to understand the endocannabinoid system. So today's talk is we're going to go over history. I'm going to talk a little bit about the current situation, what needs to be done to make the situation even better. And as Candace said, it's gotten a lot better since 1996. Okay, so this tells you a little bit about myself. I've been in the practice of cannabinoid medicine for a long time. The Wall Street Journal named me their doctor of the day. I've taught at UCSB, San Diego State, UCSF, and I've written these books, Cannabis Medicine, A Guide to the Practice of Cannabinoid Medicine, and Drugs Are Not the Devil's Tools. I've been fortunate to be able to speak all over the United States as well as all over the world. Let's move on and let you hear some of what I have to say. All right, so we'll move on some more. So we're going to talk about the history of medicinal cannabis, prohibition, propaganda, and its folly, the Marijuana Tax Act, and more importantly, the modern history. But the modern history does stand on a very firm foundation that's been around for thousands of years. This is an old slide. There are many more states now that have legalized cannabis, either THC, CBD, or the whole plant. What's important for those of us who recognize the medical utility of cannabis, and I say that both in terms of dealing with wellness and dealing with illness, is we need to overcome about 110 years of propaganda. William Randolph Hearst started beating up on cannabis and calling it marijuana around the time of the Mexican Revolution, which would be 1910 or so. We need to address patient and physician fears. I was just talking to Candace before this, suggesting that talking about the myths that exist would make a good presentation, and we'll probably do that at some time in the future. It's very important to educate physicians. Those of you out there who are patients would do well to ask your physician what they know about cannabis, or can they recommend it. I can tell you that about 100 or more local physicians in southern Santa Barbara County have referred one or more patients to me. And that's in large part because they don't teach about the endocannabinoid system in medical schools, even though it's the largest neurotransmitter system in the human body. And it was characterized as far back as 1992. We need to treat cannabis as a medicine it is and has been for thousands of years. And you need to be prepared to deal with the blowback from people who are full of misinformation, and their ideas and attitudes are influenced by inaccurate propaganda. So let's go into this history, this long and interesting history. Cannabis has appeared in every major pharmacopeia ever written. The first one by Chinese oral tradition is thought to be the Ping Tao Ching, the plowman's medical handbook. The writer was thought to be the second emperor of China, maybe mythical. He's also the god of agriculture and the god of pharmacy, showing that this was not just oral tradition. An excavation of a tomb in China about 5 or 10 years ago found evidence of its medical use. They found the shaman's medical bag, and what do you know? In the medical bag was cannabis, not a surprise. So other major materia medica in which you can find cannabis is for Ayurvedic medicine, which is in India, and it's a hard copy. It's on stone. It's dated somewhere to 1100 to 1700 BCE. Evers Papyrus was dated to 1500 BCE. In 70 AD was the Discordus Materia Medica. He was Nero's physician. But more importantly for us here in the United States and in Europe is that in 1804, Napoleon's army returned from Egypt and brought with them cannabis. In fact, in the 19th century, more articles concerning the medical value of cannabis were written in French than in any other language. In 1839, W.B. O'Shaughnessy, who was a physician, returned from India, where he had been involved in putting the telegraph across India, and for which he was knighted. He discovered that people were using cannabis medically. He did some work with animals to assure himself that it was safe, and then he treated people with cannabis both in India and upon his return to England. The use of cannabis as a medicine in the West caught on very rapidly. In the 1850s, it found its way into the United States Pharmacopeia, the USP, which is a accumulation of therapeutic substances that are widely in use in the United States. And it was in there until 1942. Ancient uses of cannabis, not too surprisingly, are similar to what some of the uses are today. Treatment for pain, migraines, treating indigestion, sleep use. All of those are reasons for doctors recommending cannabis here in the 21st century. As I said earlier, it's in the United States Pharmacopeia from 1854 until 1941. And the father of modern medicine, Sir William Osler, who wrote the first textbook of internal medicine in 1892, said that cannabis was the best treatment for migraines. In 1906, we had the most effective drug law ever passed, the Harrison Narcotic Tax Act. It prohibited nothing. It required ingredients to be placed on the patent medicine packages, and there was a dramatic decrease in patent medicine sales. 1914, you had the Harrison Narcotic Tax Act, and this was the work of a couple of overzealous drug warriors, Bishop Charles Brent and Dr. Hamilton Wright, who was a nephew-in-law to later President of the United States, William Howard Taft. Like most drug laws, it was aimed at specific groups to try to marginalize them, in this case, the Chinese and African Americans. In 1916, you had the Schlichten decorticators. Schlichten had invested $400,000 in 1910 money and 20 years to develop this piece of machinery, which made cannabis competitive with wood pulp in terms of making paper, as well as other industrial uses. This proved to be a mixed blessing. This is his decorticator. It was a threat to a number of industries: cotton, wood pulp, and most importantly, the oil industry, the petrochemical industry. And they were responsible, at least Lamont DuPont. The circumstantial evidence demonstrates that he had a large hand in the Marijuana Tax Act. So cannabis was used as medicine, as we know, for thousands of years, but in the West from at least the early 1800s, and certainly in the US from the 1850s. When we get to the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, cannabis was the third most common ingredient in patent medicines and prescriptions after opium and alcohol. In the early teens and into the 20s, there were a number of over-the-counter preparations as well as prescription medication that contained cannabis. There were 25 to 30 over-the-counter preparations, that is, you could get them without a prescription, available in just about every pharmacy in the land. Asthma cigarettes, cigarettes for treating asthma or COPD were available. There were at least 3 of them, including Cigars de Joy, Canadana, and Grimaldi. And like Advair, cannabis is both an anti-inflammatory and a bronchodilator, so it's easy to see why it would be useful for asthma. Obviously, if any of you have asthma out there, your best choice would be to use cannabis sublingually or as a tincture, although the respiratory route of administration is used by a number of people. The problem with the respiratory route of administration is that it can be associated with increased cough, increased sputum production, and increased bronchial irritation. So here's the Cigars de Joy. You can see they say it's for asthma, bronchitis, hay fever, influenza, and shortness of breath. And that's because it's a bronchodilator and an anti-inflammatory. So I mentioned that cannabis was widely available in over-the-counter preparations, but American doctors also wrote millions of prescriptions a year in the 1920s that contained cannabis. And that's in part because cannabis, the endocannabinoid system, being the largest neurotransmitter system in the human body, affects a number of different organ systems. It also is largely responsible for homeostasis. It slows the speed of neurotransmission, and it downregulates the immune system. So it has an enormous number of potential medical value, and this is why doctors wrote so many prescriptions in the 1920s and 1930s, and it's also why the AMA testified against the Marijuana Tax Act. Some of you who are my age may remember Louis Armstrong, and Armstrong smoked cannabis every day after he was 25, and he said that it was the only thing that allowed him to deal with the rampant racism that existed in his day and sadly exists in our day. So there were a lot of drug companies, pharmaceutical companies that you've heard of that marketed cannabis, whole cannabis, powdered cannabis, whole leaf cannabis. So you can see Eli Lilly, Squibb, Merck, a number of other pharmaceutical companies marketed it. And why not? It was very useful and it was in demand. Unfortunately, we started to see plant-based medicine, not just cannabis, go out of fashion. We had what I call the cult of modernism, and plant-based medicines were not seen as modern. and they also are harder to standardize than single molecule synthetic molecules. So we had a number of things that were going on that made people feel that they were modern. You had the telephone, the phonograph, electric lights, automobile, television, camera, movies. The Flexner Report is a report that was made by the AMA, and it was meant to marginalize those branches of medicine that were practicing quackery. It was a little bit overly broad, and it tended to marginalize those branches of medicine that placed the most emphasis or the most strength of value on plant-based medicine, the homeopaths, the naturopaths, the osteopaths. And it helped to make doctors feel that plant-based medicine was not modern. So my father was a pharmacist, and so was my uncle. They went to the University of Minnesota School of Pharmacy, and in 1928, one of their assignments was to make tincture of cannabis. And my father told me that they had to be very careful because the alcohol was illegal. Of course, the cannabis was not. Okay. Oh, and I have my father's 1927 Remington's Textbook of Pharmacy. And in the 1927 version of Remington's Textbook of Pharmacy, it not only tells you how to make tincture of cannabis, but that it's useful in treating pain and anxiety. And in a study that the American Academy of Cannabinoid Medicine did a few years back, we found that the most common reason for doctors to recommend cannabis was to treat pain, and the second most common reason was anxiety. Clearly, cannabis and the human body have changed not too much since 1927. So if cannabis was so popular, what the heck happened? I mean, how did we get the crazy laws that we had? Well, we had the onset of manufactured pharmaceuticals, aspirin being the first one. There was an article in Collier's magazine, which was a very influential magazine, about the problems with patent medicines, and so people tended to overgeneralize. The Sikhs who used hashish were vilified by the San Francisco Chronicle. You had the Flexner Report that I mentioned. William Randolph Hearst, who had a string of newspapers, his ranch in Sonora was confiscated by Pancho Villa, and only had 800,000 acres, probably just a little cabin, I guess. And then, of course, we had the Schlichten's Decorticator, the Cult of Modernism. Harry Anslinger, who you've all heard of, gets way more credit than he deserves. He was an opportunistic bureaucrat, and I'm trying to turn my phone off here and won't turn off. Anyway, Anslinger was the first director of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. I do not know why the phone won't turn off. Okay. All right. So
technology, you know.
Yes. Anyway, he was a racist, and he was concerned that his bureaucracy was going to get smaller because they were responsible for enforcing alcohol prohibition, and that was going out of style. Lamont DuPont of the DuPont Chemical Company probably lobbied the guy named Oliphant, who was the head attorney for the Treasury Department, to write the Marijuana Tax Act. And the propaganda focused on the word marijuana because most people in the United States at that time had no idea what marijuana was. They knew what hemp was. They knew what cannabis was. And even the jazz musicians didn't call it marijuana. They called it Muggles or Mary Jane. So this was not by accident that they used the word marijuana. As a matter of fact, the AMA, who testified against the Marijuana Tax Act, said, we almost didn't show up to testify because we didn't know you were talking about cannabis. So I mentioned that there were a lot of cannabis containing prescriptions written in the 20s and 30s, that you had lots of over-the-counter preparations that contain cannabis, and that The plant-based medicine tended to go out of style because of the cult of modernism. The manufactured pharmaceutical were seen as modern. Cannabis was not standardized at the time, and herbs have multiple compounds as opposed to a single compound that you would find in a synthetic product. So, prohibition propaganda. This stuff is incredibly wild, incredibly unbelievable, and incredibly untrue. So there was this concern that it would make youth go wild, and that they would kill people, or that they would rape people, or whatever. They would become bad people. You know, they played heavily on the sex angle. What's interesting about this slide, and somebody pointed that out to me, number one, you don't usually inject marijuana because it's fat soluble, not water soluble. And the other thing is that the man injecting this woman is African American. And I didn't notice that initially. And of course, the woman is white. So there was a whole string of racism and anti-Hispanic propaganda that came mainly out of the mouth of Harry Anslinger. Reefer Madness was a movie that Anslinger promoted. He may have even paid for it out of the federal money. And I remember seeing this movie in 1972 in Berkeley, and the audience couldn't contain themselves. They were laughing so much. This was not a comedy. And here we go. I mean, it makes women, you know, just wild, I guess. Here's another wild woman, wild man too, I suppose. You know, assassin of youth. What I found is that most kids who take cannabis before the age of 15 either have post-traumatic stress syndrome, attention deficit disorder, or both. I remember a waitress came up to me at a restaurant, kind of an informal Italian restaurant near Zuma Beach, where I was being interviewed by a reporter for the online edition of USA Today. We happened to be talking about the use of cannabis for migraine. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had just been stopped for that, and he had a recommendation, so he got off, but it certainly made the news. And so the waitress came over, maybe in her late 30s, early 40s, said, you know, I have a son, he's 16, 17 years old, and he's using cannabis. And about a week or about a month after he started using cannabis, he noticed he was better able to do his homework, better able to pay attention to lectures, and his grades went from C's and D's to A's and B's. So, I mean, cannabis is very helpful for people with attention deficit disorder. This idea that cannabis is a entry drug is exactly backwards. It's an exit drug. At least 4 states have legalized cannabis for the treatment of opiate use disorder. And most of us who've been practicing cannabinoid medicine have seen a decrease in reliance on opiates for pain because of cannabis benefit in terms of being an analgesic. Just somebody writing a pulp mystery and again demonizing cannabis for no good reason. I have never seen cannabis affect women in such a way that they stick their breasts out and cross their legs, but apparently that was common in the 30s and 40s. And you have the devil's harvest. And the interesting thing I should mention about the devil is that one of the reasons that cannabis was not used in Europe was because in 1484, Pope Innocent VIII said that cannabis was the tool of the devil. And the reason he said it was a tool of the devil is because midwives, whom the Pope referred to as witches, used it in order to ease the pain of childbirth. And of course, we all know that the pain of childbirth was God's punishment for Eve eating from the tree of wisdom and knowledge, so they say. So While cannabis continued to be used in Europe in cereal, it was a major constituent of gruel. Dickens gave gruel a bad name because it was watered down in the where the people who were waiting to be adopted were, the orphans, the orphanages. And also, cannabis is a cousin to hops, and so it continued to be available in Europe in beer. And you can get beer now that gets its alcoholic beverage from alcohol content from the fermentation of cannabis as opposed to the fermentation of hops. So let's talk a little bit about the Marijuana Tax Act. All of this propaganda, reefer madness and such, was a lead up to the Marijuana Tax Act being introduced into the Congress. The person who carried the legislation was somebody who often carried legislation for DuPont, a man named Robert Doherty, who was a North Carolina Democrat and racist. The law was probably pushed by DuPont and the petrochemical interest because of competition from hemp. Hemp, the waste product, is the inner core, the hemp hurd, which is mainly cellulose. So why would DuPont be concerned about cellulose? Well, one thing, they were a munitions maker, and apparently you need cellulose to make munitions. They also made rayon and nylon, which are made from cellulose, cellophane, made from cellulose. All of these synthetics, similar products, could be made from the cellulose in hemp. They also made sulfites, which were used to make paper from both wood pulp and hemp, but you needed 4 times as much to make paper from wood pulp as you did from hemp. They also made tetraethyl lead, which was an additive to gasoline. And finally, they were the largest shareholder in General Motors. Why is that important? Well, that's important because Henry Ford, and you can check this out looking at images on Google, had a concept car in the late 1930s that not only had an acrylic embedded with hemp, the upholstery was made from hemp, but it ran on hemp ethanol. In fact, Ford always felt that cars would run on ethanol, on plant-based fuel, rather than oil, and specifically hemp ethanol. Harry Anslinger, as I said, was an opportunistic bureaucrat. His bureaucracy was getting smaller because the alcohol prohibition was going out of style, both nationally and state by state. And he saw this as a way to increase the number of people in his fiefdom. And everything that Anslinger testified to in 1937 proved not to be true. In fact, the AMA, testifying against the act, said that all Anslinger had was a fistful of newspaper clippings. One of the things they probably weren't aware of is most of the newspaper articles were ghostwritten by Anslinger himself. In 1948, Anslinger testified that cannabis made you passive, not aggressive. In 1937, he said it would cause you to kill your brother. So, one way to be right is to get on both sides of the issue. That's also one way to be a liar. So the guy who testified against the Marijuana Tax Act for the AMA was not just anybody. He was the AMA's chief attorney. He also was an MD, and as you can see, he'd been commissioner of health for Washington, D.C., a health commissioner for Boston, past president of the American Public Health Association, and chief legal counsel of the AMA. His testimony is worth reading. He was aggressively opposed to the Marijuana Tax Act. And one of the things he said that's important is the AMA knows of no dangers from the medical use of cannabis. He knew his way around Washington, so he checked with a number of different governmental agencies, the Bureau of Prisons, the Children's Bureau, the Office of Education, divisions of mental health and pharmacy, and the Public Health Service. Not one of them had one shred of evidence to support Harry Anslinger's outrageous claims. Again, I mentioned that cannabis was marijuana was used rather than cannabis, and the AMA was very critical of that because they said we almost didn't show up because we didn't know that you were talking about cannabis. And this is still a problem in that people try to make distinctions. In fact, a famous entheobotanist, I'm blocking on his name, Schultes, Dr. Schultes, Richard E. Schultes, who was a professor at Harvard, in a letter that he wrote to Mike Crowitz, who's in charge of a veterans organization. He wrote it in 1995. Schultes was quite old by that time, and he said, marijuana, cannabis, hemp, they're all the same plant. There aren't three plants, there's one plant. The dividing line between hemp and cannabis is an arbitrary line drawn by a bureaucrat that says if this plant has less than 0.3% of THC in it, we're going to call it hemp. And if it has more than 0.3%, we're going to call it cannabis. Same plant, bureaucratic dictum. Anyway, for reasons that aren't entirely clear to me, and I've talked to a couple of other historians, but we believe that was largely political, cannabis was removed from the United States Pharmacopeia. Interestingly, in 1942, the longtime editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, Morris Fishbein, who just coincidentally had been on the staff of the Flexen Report, echoed what Sir William Osler had to say in 1892, that cannabis was the best treatment for migraine headaches. And that was in 1942, the year after cannabis was removed from the U.S. Pharmacopeia. Threw this in here for something about the 40s. That's Marilyn Monroe. I taught a course at UCSB about 20 years ago and mentioned Joe DiMaggio and got a bunch of blank stares. But I think people still remember who Marilyn Monroe is, even though they may not know Joe DiMaggio, who was one of the greatest baseball players of all time and also happened to be Marilyn's second or third husband. Anyway, there was a very high-profile arrest of Robert Mitchum, and that's Mr. Mitchum in jail. And he had a sense of humor. When arrested, he was asked his occupation, and he said former movie actor. He could see his career going down the drain. He and a couple of other people were partying at this house, and it was probably a put-up job. And one of the actresses happened to be Marilyn Monroe. How do I know this? I have a good friend of mine who actually is going to have Thanksgiving dinner with Mitchum's kids and grandkids. And he pushed Marilyn out the bedroom window. And he told my friend that it was difficult because her fanny was so big it almost wouldn't fit through the window. So Marilyn did not get arrested, but poor Lila Leeds here had her career ended. The movie She Should Have Said No was written by the same guy who wrote the Reefer Madness, so you can imagine how good that movie was. This was an Italian movie, which I think had nothing to do with marijuana, but they thought they put the name on it. John Wayne was in the movie. I can't tell you a thing about it, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. So we move on to more modern times. Richard Nixon, we'll talk a little bit more about him in a minute or two, made Elvis Presley an honorary DEA agent, which, when you think about the fact that Elvis died from a drug overdose, is really ironic. And kind of a typical thing that you think that Nixon might do. So there were some changes that were going on from the 1930s, although they were pretty slow until we got to 1964. But the Dr. Fishbein, I said cannabis was the best migraine treatment. Colonel Phelan, editor of Military Surgeon, criticized the Marijuana Tax Act. The New York Academy of Medicine recommended legalization for recreational purposes. In 1949, the first modern study was done by Ramsey and Davis. They showed that 5 out of 7 kids who had cerebral palsy and intractable seizures had practically no seizures with synthetic THC. This is much better than the current Epidiolex, which is only CBD and lowers the rate of seizures by 30%, whereas Ramsey and Davis found that THC lowered it by closer to 100%. Colonel Phelan wasn't done yet. In 1954, he was still upset with the Marijuana Tax Act. In 1969, the U.S. Supreme Court said the Marijuana Tax Act was unconstitutional. So for about a year, there was no federal law against cannabis. So in 1972, you had or 1970, take your pick, you had the Nixon Marijuana Commission, which recommended legalizing cannabis, even though Nixon told him not to. Robert Randall, who had glaucoma, was the first independent new drug program, and the federal government sent him 300 hand-rolled cannabis cigarettes a month for the rest of his life. Eventually, in 1978, the independent new drug program expanded. Eventually, there were 15 people in it. It was terminated in 1992. 15 people remained in it. There's only one remaining now, Irv Rosenfeld. In 1988, and this is interesting, the DEA's chief administrative law judge recommended rescheduling cannabis. This was after a 2-year rescheduling hearing to Schedule II, and in his finding of fact said that cannabis was one of the safest therapeutic agents known to man. In 1964, Raphael Mechoulam characterized the molecular character of delta-9 THC, and then the search was on to find a receptor for it, and in the late 1980s, early 1990s, that was found, and that was called the endocannabinoid system. In 1996, Prop 215, and tomorrow will be the 25-year anniversary of its passing, passed in California. It was also legalized in Arizona, but the state legislature was quick to overturn the will of the people. An excellent report that existed in the 1990s was written by the House of Lords Science and Technology Committee. It's about 20 pages long, and anybody that's interested in the history of cannabis as medicine, I suggest you take a look at it. They were concerned because so many people with multiple sclerosis were being arrested for possession of cannabis in England. This prompted GW Pharmaceuticals, whose president was Dr. Jeffrey Guy, who had been involved in plant-based medicine, to do research on the use of cannabis for multiple sclerosis, and that started in 1999. Also in 1999, the Institute of Medicine came out with a report on cannabis and said that it did have medical value and that its side effects were consistent with the side effects of the majority of prescription medication on the market at that time. Conant versus Walter is something that's important for the physicians and nurse practitioners and physicians' assistants out there. It basically found that if you become a medical professional, you do not check your First Amendment rights at the door. If somebody asks you, what do you think about cannabis? You can tell them, this is what I think about it. It's good, it's bad, it's indifferent. In 2005, Sativex, which is a product made by GW Pharmaceuticals, nabiximols is its generic name. It's about 50% THC and 50% CBD. In 2009, the AMA House of Delegates requested that the government reschedule cannabis to at least Schedule II to make it easier to do research on it. In 2010, Sativex was made legal in the European Union, still not legal in the United States. In 2014, both Washington and Colorado legalized adult use. 2018, you had Epidiolex, which is 100% CBD, does not contain THC, and therefore doesn't work as well as anti-seizure medications based on cannabis that do contain THC. We're going to pass on this. So the marijuana, Nixon Marijuana Commission came out of a law that was passed in 1970, directed the formation of a commission to study drug abuse in marijuana. Cannabis was temporarily put in Schedule 1. It's still temporarily there. And as I said, Nixon discouraged the people. He appointed 9 of the 13 people not to make it legal. And of course, they did make it legal. Okay. And the commission report is very good. There's a lot of really good research that was done, and you can learn even more than what I'm going over here. They did recommend legalizing the recreational use of cannabis, but President Nixon rejected it. Okay. So this is an interesting quote that came from John Ehrlichman, who was one of Nixon's right-hand men. And he said the reason that cannabis was Schedule 1 and the reason that heroin was Schedule 1 was in an effort to marginalize his two main critics, the anti-war activists and African Americans. And he said this to Dan Baum, who wrote a very good book called Smoke and Mirrors, and I commend that book to you. Okay, so now we're going to talk more about contemporary use of cannabis as medicine. And this is something that some of you will be fairly familiar with. I mentioned Ramsey and Davis and the success that they had in treating seizure disorder in 7 kids who had intractable seizures. And they said, you know, we think that this should have further trials in non-institutionalized epileptics, easy for me to say. And over 60 years later, that recommendation was followed. And as I indicated earlier, Dr. Mechoulam and Dr. Goana characterized the structure of delta-9 THC. Now, delta-9 THC is one of over 140 cannabinoids, cannabinoid being a 21 carbon molecule that either stimulates or blocks the body's cannabinoid receptors, not too creatively called the CB1 receptor and CB2 receptors. And there's a few other receptors that the endocannabinoids and the phytocannabinoids can stimulate. So between 1964 and the early 1990s, they looked for the receptors and found them, and eventually the endocannabinoid system was characterized. So I mentioned the Compassionate Investigational New Drug Program, and that, what's his name, Robert Randall was the initial entrant, and he had glaucoma. And what's his name? Irv Rosenfeld is now the only remaining. Irv has a very painful connective tissue disorder where he has cartilage that grows into his joints. Very painful, and cannabis helps provide some relief. THC, which everybody gets all uptight about, it's been legal since the 1980s. There's the brand name is Marinol, synthetic THC, and the generic name is dronabinol. It's not synthetic marijuana because cannabis has over 140 cannabinoids. This slide is a little old, and over 200 terpenes. Marinol is Schedule 3. Cannabis is Schedule 1. Marinol is more likely to cause you to be dizzy, to be sleepy than cannabis because cannabis contains CBD, which partially blocks some of the effects of THC. So here we are. Marinol is, and just about any doctor can write a prescription for Marinol. If you're in a legal state, you can write a prescription for marijuana, but if you're not in a legal state, you can't. Okay, so I mentioned it was characterized circa 1992. It's the largest neurotransmitter system found in humans. It is found in humans and all mammals. Probably goes back 600 million years. Central to homeostasis. It interacts with the dopamine system. It modulates the speed of neurotransmission. So you can see that the endocannabinoid system is pretty important Nevertheless, the majority of medical schools have yet to teach about it. So the endocannabinoid system contains, as I said, 2 major receptors and 4 or 5 minor receptors, neurotransmitters, the endocannabinoids, and the phytocannabinoids have pretty much the same effect as the endo, meaning inside cannabinoids. And then there are a couple of enzymes that can metabolize both the phytocannabinoids and the endocannabinoids. And this shows you where the CB1 and CB2 receptors are. The CB1 receptors are largely in the brain, the nervous system, and the CB2 receptors are largely in the immune system and in the periphery. One of the things that's important to understand is something called retrograde inhibition, and that's the mechanism by which cannabis slows the speed of neurotransmission. The endocannabinoids go backwards, hence retrograde, to the presynaptic neuron. They cause the release of dopamine, and the dopamine causes depolarization of the presynaptic neuron, making it more difficult for that neuron to be stimulated. And let's see if I can find that. Yeah. So this shows you retrograde inhibition. The cannabinoid signaling going from the postsynaptic neuron to the presynaptic neuron, and then depolarizing the presynaptic neuron, making it more difficult for the next neural impulse coming along to stimulate the postsynaptic neuron. And what that does is it means that, let's say you have post-traumatic stress disorder, your midbrain will signal danger, signal that there's a problem out there. If you slow the speed of neural activity, your cerebral cortex will say, no, there's not any danger out there, just relax. And a lot of people with PTSD do get benefit, and the reason they get benefit from cannabis is because of this retrograde inhibition. And it also, you can see how it would be helpful in treating seizure disorder, treating migraine, treating attention deficit disorder, treating Crohn's disease. So there's any number of reasons why cannabis is a medicine, and we know some of those reasons, but not all. So let's talk about cannabis, the plant. And as I mentioned, this is an old slide. It has over 512 molecules, over 140 cannabinoids, over 200 terpenes, and some phenoids and some flavonoids. Terpenes give cannabis its distinctive odor. I mentioned the House of Lords report that I suggest that you take a look at if you're interested in this. I mentioned the mixamol. It's a tincture of cannabis sublingual spray, a whole plant alcohol extract from 2 strains of cannabis in a 1-to-1 THC to CBD ratio. That shouldn't say cannabis opposed in 2005. It should say cannabis Canada approved in 2005. I'm sorry. Clinton really was a hypocrite. I don't believe that he did not inhale. So cannabis has a lot of therapeutic value. Marinol is used as an appetite stimulant and an anti-nauseant. As I mentioned, cannabis is an analgesic. We've already talked about it being an anti-epileptic, about being useful in treating anxiety. It's also useful in treating inflammation, and therefore useful in treating autoimmune diseases, and does this by downregulating the immune system. So the list of conditions that cannabis can be beneficial for is almost too long for its own good. One of the last ones there is anti-proliferative. That means that it can kill cancer cells. How long have we known that? Since 1974, when some research was done by Dr. Billy Mays at the Medical College of Virginia. Cannabis is safe. A lot of governmental study committees have said so. Great Britain and India, Canada, Australia, the Panama Canal Zone by the Army, and the United States with the Nixon Commission. And we've talked about the Marinol being approved in 1985, the finding of fact by that should be DEA's Chief Administrative Law Judge Francis Young, that cannabis was one of the safest therapeutic agents known to man. safer than eating 10 potatoes, is what he said. Okay. See if I can get to the next slide. So there's a lot of different routes of administration. The one that is commonly used recreationally is respiratory. That's the easiest to titrate. It acts very quickly, say from 30 to 60 seconds. Either it's therapeutic or recreational effect will last for 1 to 3 hours. Oral can be taken as a liquid, a tea, edibles, spiked beverages, tincture. If you take it orally, it will take about 45 minutes to 75 minutes before it's effective. So it's easier to overdose with oral than with respiratory, and it will last from 3 to 6 hours. Sublingual spray or drops, it takes about 15 minutes before it's effective. Rectal is used when you're taking large doses. It's often used in Europe for treating cancer because there are three veins that drain the pelvic floor. Only one of them goes to the liver. The reason that that's important is that the liver metabolizes cannabis into 11-hydroxy-THC and 9-carboxy-THC. And 11-hydroxy-THC is several times more euphorogenic than delta-9-THC. Topical usually is not going to have much of an effect on your blood level of THC, but it's very useful in treating autoimmune disease and in treating skin conditions that can cause pain. And we talked about this already, how long these last, what the onset is. And this is kind of important if you're driving a car. If you get stopped, I still do expert witness work. Been pretty lucky lately, and most of the people that I testify for get off. I don't think it's me. I think it's the facts. They shouldn't have been charged in the first place, and they also had a good attorney. So, as you all know, the admonition is to go slow and start low with your dose. I usually start with 2.5 milligrams because Marinol comes in 2.5, 5, and 10 milligram dosage forms. And I'd like to start off with the prescription just so I can defend myself if the medical board just says, well, why did you give him cannabis? Because the THC didn't work would be the right answer for that. So many conditions respond well to 2.5 or 5 milligrams of THC or THC and CBD. What I found by just prescribing Marinol, that is THC, is that dysphoria can occur as low as 10 milligrams of THC and usually at 15 to 20 milligrams. And at that level, you need to add the same amount of CBD because it blocks about a third of the THC-induced euphoria. And I mentioned that 11-hydroxy-THC, a metabolite of delta-9-THC, is more euphorogenic than delta-9. So one of the things that's important to admit to critics that you're arguing with is there are side effects of cannabis. Mm-hmm. You can have euphoria, although euphoria means a sense of well-being, so I wouldn't call that a negative side effect. Dysphoria is feeling uncomfortably out of touch with reality. Panic attacks, which usually occurs in naive users or experienced users who use relatively high doses of THC. Paranoia, same thing. Hyperemesis, we saw an increase in that when recreational cannabis was legalized. Normally when people are using cannabis as a medicine, what they're looking for is the medicinal effect, not the recreational effect. And so we didn't see hyperemesis that commonly when there was just medical cannabis. But when we moved to recreational, the emergency room saw an uptick in people who had controllable vomiting. And drowsiness, it can be a side effect, and it can cause impaired driving, but it doesn't always. The impaired driving is driving real slow, driving real carefully, slight weaving in between the lane lines. And I can tell you this, that in the last several cases, and I've testified in hundreds of cases, nobody has been found guilty of impaired driving from cannabis. And that's because they weren't, not because I'm such a great expert. So the most common side effect of cannabis is none. Euphoria is the second one. maybe increased appetite and possibly anxiety. Less common side effects, we've talked about them: dysphoria, panic attacks, hyperemesis, paranoia. The side effects are dose and experience related. With most psychoactive drugs, what you're looking at is set, setting, and previous experience, as well as dose. As I mentioned earlier, 15 milligrams of THC alone leads a majority of users to complain that they don't like the way they feel. A minority likes the way they feel. And as I said, CBD tends to decrease about a third of the euphoria. Who is Maureen Dowd? She is a columnist for the New York Times. In 2014, they sent her out to Denver, and she went into a dispensary and picked up a candy bar. The candy bar had 100 milligrams of THC and less than 1 milligram of CBD. It was scored, so she broke off a piece and ate 10 milligrams of THC, waited about 10 or 15 minutes. Of course, nothing happened. She took it orally. So broke off another piece. Wait another 10 or 15 minutes. Nothing happened. Figured, hey, I'm a columnist from New York. I write for the New York Times. This probably doesn't work on me. So she ate the whole candy bar. And if you want, you can go on Google and look up Maureen Dowd and cannabis, and you'll find she was in a fetal position for about 6 hours. Don't eat 100 milligrams of THC with less than 1 milligram of CBD. That's your lesson there. I think Maureen Dowd learned that lesson too. Okay, so here's just some more conditions. I won't go into them in any detail. It can be used to treat depression, anxiety, stress, bipolar disorder. Dr. Daniel Piamelli at UC Irvine has said it's useful in treating bipolar disorder and attention deficit disorder. It's useful in treating autism and Asperger's disorder. By slowing down the speed of neurotransmission, it's very helpful in many of these conditions. Oh, well, I think we'll skip this. AIDS patients, it helps. It's an appetite stimulant, an anti-nausea, and antidepressant. Benefits to cancer patients. It's the analgesic, anti-nauseate, appetite stimulant, antidepressant, anti-proliferative. And the GW Pharmaceuticals did a study where they used 150 milligrams of cannabinoids a day. Now, I was on a panel in Australia with a number of experts on cannabis and cancer, and they said that you need 300 to 800 milligrams a day. Nevertheless, even though these people with glioblastoma, which is a very aggressive disease, brain tumor, the people who were treated with standard treatment survived 330 days from the date of diagnosis. The people who use 150 milligrams of cannabinoids survive 550 days, or 40% longer. We need to have more studies that use higher dosages. So I mentioned ADD, I mentioned retrograde inhibition. You can use it with the conventional treatment of Adderall or other amphetamine-like stimulants. And PTSD, it treats the anxiety, it helps control the anger, again, by slowing the speed of neurotransmission, decreases nightmares. And we've seen this happen time and time again when soldiers, returning soldiers, have the ability to use as much cannabis as they want. Now, this is one of the myths that maybe we'll talk about in greater length when I do my presentation on myths, but there was a wonderful study, I think I'll bring that up next, done by Sarah Torres Vargas from Columbia University, who looked at 30 studies of women who used cannabis during pregnancy and found that there was no significant or consistent or relevant abnormal findings in any of those 30 studies and in 30 studies taken together. Dr. Melanie Dreyer, who I think retired recently as Dean of the School of Nursing at Rush Medical School, did a study in Jamaica in 1968. Her follow-up study in 1972 found that the children of women who smoked cannabis during pregnancy did better in school, reached their developmental landmarks sooner than children of women who did not. the National Institute of Drug Abuse had intended to follow up on this for a long time, but decided not to because the results were positive when they had hoped they'd be negative. This was a study that was done by Donald Tashkin, who's an emeritus professor of pulmonology at UCLA. He looked at 1,100 patients in the Los Angeles County Cancer Registry who had cancers of the head and neck, and paired them up with 1,100 people of similar sex, age, and geographic area, and found that while there was no relationship showing that cannabis caused lung cancer, there was a relationship showing that cannabis might prevent lung cancer. And we do know that cancer is cannabis is an anti-cancer drug. So one of the things that needs to happen in order for more research to be done is for cannabis to be scheduled out of Schedule 1. There's no reason for it to be in Schedule 1. It should be rescheduled or descheduled. I think I'm going to skip this. Epidiolex, we talked about that. Actually, there's no THC in it. They initially wanted to do research with CBD and a small amount of THC, and the government said, nah, we can't allow that. It was Schedule 5, but it's now been descheduled. And of course, the scheduling makes no sense at all. That's because it wasn't meant to. Epidiolex was Schedule 5, now it's descheduled. THC is Schedule 3. CBD is Schedule 1, I guess, but they're talking about changing it. And cannabis is also Schedule 1. Okay. And this scheduling thing it's part of the politics, not part of the science. Okay. Raich versus Ashcroft was reversed in Gonzalez versus Raich. The Supreme Court said that you couldn't grow your own marijuana. Okay. We talked about Conner versus Walter. We've talked about Gonzalez versus Raich. Tincture of cannabis met the FDA safety criteria for phase 3 clinical trial. Prescription cannabis, tincture of cannabis is available in 20 countries. The Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment blocked the use of money in the federal budget to enforce federal marijuana laws. Epidiolex, which is CBD, is legal, is descheduled. Okay. So these things were important before things loosened up. You needed to have a bona fide doctor-patient relationship, do a good faith history and physical. The doctor needed to review the medical records. There needed to be a plan with objectives and have a condition which would benefit from the use of cannabis. Still not bad criteria. So to date, there have been over 25,000 published articles in the scientific literature referencing the endocannabinoid system, cannabis plant, and cannabinoids. And nearly half of them were published within the last 5 years. Okay, so Dr. McAllister did some research with either mice or dogs, I can't remember which, and he found that by giving them an intraperitoneal injection of THC, that the cancer was cured. If you gave an intraperitoneal injection of saline, cancer roared on. Dr. McAllister has tried to get funding to do a study on humans and has not been able to obtain that funding, which is really a shame. The University of California now has several cannabis research centers. Now, the first one was at the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine. UC Irvine has one. UCLA has one. UC Davis has one. The San Diego was founded in 2000. It was funded by the state of California. There were 18 FDA-approved cannabis studies, and the senator's report to the legislature came out in 2011. They concluded that evidence is accumulating that cannabinoids may be useful medicine for certain indications. And they go on to say that the classification of marijuana as a Schedule I drug, as well as the continuing controversy as to whether or not cannabis is of medical value, are obstacles to medical progress in this area. Based on evidence currently available, the Schedule I classification is not tenable. It is not accurate that cannabis has no medical value or that information on safety is lacking. And this just reviews what I said earlier. In the 1920s, American doctors wrote 3 million prescriptions a year that contained cannabis. And in 1937, the AMA, in testifying against the Marijuana Tax Act, said the AMA knows of no dangers from the medicinal use of cannabis. This would seem to set to rest the concerns that cannabis has some kind of health dangers. I also mentioned the DEA's chief administrative law judge, Francis Young, in recommending the rescheduling of cannabis, found that cannabis was one of the safest therapeutic agents known to man. So one of our top needs now, product standardization, we're getting that. Better testing and labeling. Labs still have trouble in testing this because it's plant. We need more professionalism in growing, dispensing, and prescribing. We need more research. We need to have healthcare providers certified as cannabis medicine specialists. And we need the public, of legislators, of doctors, nurses, medical students, and nursing students. We need to label all products, which we're doing. We need to put more on there in terms of the plant constituents. There should be an FDA driving warning. Warning, don't drive, operate heavy equipment, or engage in dangerous activity until you determine whether or not this interferes with those activities. So we should be certifying cannabinoid medicine specialists, as the AACM does. The Society of Cannabis Clinicians, AACM standards should be used for certifying cannabinoid medicine practitioners. We should try to marginalize those physicians practicing minimalist medicine, the people who are just saying, hi, here's your medicine, here's your prescription, here's your recommendation, give me your money, goodbye. Cannabinoid medicine needs to be a recognized subspecialty, and we're working on that. The AACM is in the process of sort of reconstituting itself, but these are the criteria that AACM has for being a certified cannabinoid medicine specialist. And dispensaries, in my opinion, there shouldn't be dispensaries. They should be pharmacies. The pharmacists were capable of dispensing cannabis from the 1850s until 1941. They sure as hell ought to be able to do that now. Also, the bud tenders should be trained. I had a case where I was an expert witness, and the patient got way too high a dose of THC, went and took a couple of hits, drove her car, had a panic attack, hit another car head on. One person died, another person was maimed for life. Okay, so tincture of cannabis is Epidiolex, CBD is approved, THC is approved, and Health and Human Services has a patent for CBD. So when are we going to treat this as the medicine it is? Soon, I hope. So here's some research. Take a look at the terpenes more deeply, take a look at the minor cannabinoids more deeply, assess the THC-CBD ratio more specifically, become more specific about dosages and ratios, have condition-specific dosages, and we're seeing more of that on the internet, and certain conditions that cannabis should be studied for, so that doctors can't avoid recommending cannabis. One is for sending cancer into remission, another is for treating autism spectrum disorder, another for treating post-traumatic stress disorder. Susan Sicily did a study using the federal government's cannabis from University of Mississippi, and what she found is that if you have less than 4% THC in your cannabis, you're not going to have much effect on PTSD. And ADD, we should also do studies on that. I found it to be extremely useful in treating attention deficit disorder. So the big picture is we're at a point now of looking at pharmaceuticalization versus individualism, profit versus patient. In the era of Donald Trump, profit seems to trump patient. We need to take a look at synthetics and isolates versus the whole plant. Those people who practice plant-based medicine, the naturopath, talk about the entourage effect, not just for cannabis, but for all plants. There should be federal funding of medical research. We need to deschedule or reschedule cannabis. There's over-regulation. That needs to be, the regulations need to be appropriate, not excessive. There's over-taxation, which tends to promote the black market, which we allegedly are opposed to. So professional schools need to teach cannabis as medicine. They need to teach medical students, nursing students, what have you, about the endocannabinoid system. Teach pharmacists to make tincture of cannabis. Shouldn't be too hard. It's an easy tincture to make. They should regulate dispensaries like pharmacies and recognize that cannabis has medical value and that it's been demonstrated to be very safe. Okay, so I think we've, this is just a repeat. I would suggest to anybody who's looking at this to do your homework. One way to do that is to buy my book, Cannabis Medicine, A Guide to the Practice of Cannabinoid Medicine. So we ought to use the whole plant. And botanical cannabis is serious science in medicine. And I applaud the legislators and the citizens who made cannabis legal in 31 states.
Great.
Okay, I think we're almost there. This is the education stuff. We shouldn't have qualifying conditions. It should be anything that the doctor thinks it's useful for. Juicing is a good way to avoid getting high because the raw cannabis is in the acid form and it's not euphorogenic. Some of you may be old enough to remember this man, Rodney Dangerfield. He was a patient of mine. I'm in his autobiography, which was originally going to be entitled My Lifelong Love Affair with Marijuana. There's a picture there of him looking at a piece of paper saying, with the caption saying, "Here I am looking at the best piece of mail I ever got, a letter from Dr. Bearman telling me to smoke more dope." For those of you who like history, Drugs Are Not the Devil's Tools is 500 pages long. That's the one volume set. You can also get a 2-volume set. And this is Cannabis Medicine, A Guide to the Practice of Cannabinoid Medicine, written with my co-author, Mario Pettinato, PhD, RN. And here are some more books that you may want to read. I liked Cannabis a lot by Martin Booth, who's a regular author. He tells the story about how cannabis got mislabeled as something that can cause you to be a murderer. Apparently, I won't go into it. If anybody wants to know, I'll tell you all about hashish. Okay, let's see. I think that's about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And my website is under repair. So the best way to get in touch with me is either by phone or by my email. Okay, so we went about 15 minutes over.
Yeah, you are such a wealth of information, Dr. Bearman. I wish we could just, you have so much information in your head. I love it. Thank you for sharing all this information. I've learned many things that I haven't learned before, and I've actually sat through so many seminars and different lectures and stuff. So look at all these notes that I took. It's just amazing. I really thank you for your time. I have 3 questions, if that would be okay for me to ask you these questions from the audience.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So first one is more about a condition, and then I have a question later on your thoughts about the industry. But what would you recommend in general for someone that suffers from seizures?
Suffers from what?
From seizures that has epilepsy, like a ratio or like THC flower. Like, what's your general recommendation for someone like that?
All right. So seizures are something that can occur 24/7. So the first thing is you want to take the medication 3 times a day, and you want to take it orally because it's going to last longer. The seizures are caused by uncontrolled stimulation in a particular part of the brain, different part of the brain for different people, usually around some kind of abnormality. Could be a scar tissue. It could be a abnormality of the blood vessels. And so what you want to do is you want to slow down that uncontrolled stimulation. And you do that by retrograde inhibition. Now, a really good article on retrograde inhibition was in the December 8th, 2004 Scientific America by Elger and Nickel, entitled The Brain's Own Marijuana. And it tells you how cannabis, or how the endocannabinoids, slow down the speed of neurotransmission. So I would recommend a modest dose of THC. There's no reason to take CBD because inflammation may play a small role for some people who have seizures, but in most cases, or seizure disorder, taking a modest dose of THC, and you can prevent seizures by taking this modest dose on a regular daily basis. I would say 5 to 10 milligrams 3 times a day of cannabis should, at the very least, decrease the frequency of seizures. Now, the CBD also seems to have a benefit, but the benefit pales in comparison to the THC. Yeah. You might look up what the dosage is for Epidiolex, which is 100% CBD, and it will decrease the frequency of your seizures by 30%. So in terms of ratio, I think pure THC is fine. If you find that it gets you uncomfortably high, you can throw in an equal amount of CBD. I think that's it. It's pretty straightforward in terms of why it works and that it works. Now, it's not 100%. In other words, say with Epidiolex, it's only 30%. But THC is probably closer to 90 or 95% for most people with seizures. Now, remember, there were 7 children in this study, and 5 of them had help. So seizure disorder is not caused by one particular abnormality in the brain. It's caused by all kinds of different abnormalities. So for some people, either THC or CBD will be of very little benefit. But for most people, it will be helpful.
That's a great answer. Great answer. Thank you. Another question kind of about a condition is somebody's saying that's watching that they have a patient diagnosed with cutaneous T-cell lymphoma, and they begin radiation next week. She says, should she recommend like an RSO for pain and insomnia that happens as well during that treatment?
Okay, so they're
beginning radiation next week, and she wants to give her
RSO. RSO orally, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and tell me again the kind of cancer it is.
Cutaneous T-cell lymphoma.
All right. So they have a lesion on their skin? Do we know?
They didn't put all the details into the question. So
the RSO has been shown to be anti-cancer. Mm-hmm. What the appropriate dose is hard to say. Now, I wouldn't use RSO itself because it's made with naphtha, which can have adverse health effects. But certainly, taking a concentrate that is high in THC and probably high in CBD is a good idea. You may recall earlier that I said, and I'll tell you who these people were, was Dr. Abrams, was Dr. Naru, I think his name is. He was an Israeli scientist, a female scientist from Australia, and they all said or agreed 300 to 800 milligrams of cannabinoid for 2 to 3 months. And then after that, you need to take a maintenance dose for the rest of your life. I had a fellow approach me, young man in his late 20s, at a cocktail party. It was a fundraiser for a liberal organization, and he said, "What do you know about cannabis for cancer?" And I said, "Well, not very much." But I told him what I knew. I said, you can make your own tincture. You take a kilo of cannabis and put it in alcohol for a week or two, and then you end up with about 2 ounces of thick tarry goo, and you take 3 grams of that a day for 3 months. He said, my stepfather has cancer that they've given up on. They're going to treat him for palliation, but not for cure. Cancer was of his esophagus. It had metastasized to the rib and the regional lymph nodes, and I think to the liver. So they said, this guy, we can't do anything for him. But they kept taking CT scans, and so he made up the concoction that I told him about. The stepfather used it, and about 3 months later, the son calls up and says, the cancer's gone.
Wow.
Now, it turned out that it did come back, and I don't know whether he kept using this stuff, but later on I heard a story from a friend of theirs that he worked for a defense industry and was afraid that he'd lose his job, and I guess chose to lose his life, and he stopped using the maintenance dose. But there are a number of anecdotal reports of the use of cannabis for sending cancer into remission. Now, you can't really say it cures the cancer, but you can say there's no evidence that it's there. There's several ways in which cannabis works as an anti-cancer drug. One is it interferes with the ID1 gene, which is responsible for metastasis. It interferes with angiogenesis, which is the formation of new blood vessels, and even abnormal cells need to be nourished. And finally, it causes apoptosis, which is a fancy word for programmed cell death. Mm-hmm. And I've talked to a couple of biochemists. Each has a slightly different idea. One said that they thought that the gene that controlled apoptosis had become abnormal, and that the cannabis normalized that so the cell could die naturally. The other person said something that is actually not that different, but that there's a cellular constituent called ceramide that's higher in abnormal cells than it is in normal cells, and that cannabis increases the amount of ceramide until it kills the cell. One of the things that you can say about cannabis is that it targets the abnormal cells and not the normal cells, unlike chemotherapy and radiation. The reason I asked if there was a skin lesion involved is one of these biochemists told me that their mother, their aunt, somebody that they knew had cancer that expressed itself on the arm. They did a biopsy of it, and we're going to do surgery a month later. And so he put tincture of cannabis on it, and it fell off. And when they told the surgeon what happened, he said, "Oh, no, that wasn't the cannabis. That was because we did a biopsy." To which I say, bullpucky.
Wow. Well, thank you for that really informative answer. Like you said, there's a lot of different kinds of cancer, and you would have to treat them all differently too. So that's, I think, what's really important to keep in mind when people are going into a dispensary, and asking like a bud tender for a recommendation. There's many different kinds of cancer, and so you have to treat them all differently, which leads us to...
Can I interrupt for 1 second?
Yeah.
There was an article written in 2008 by the University of Wisconsin. That's where I got my undergraduate degree. And it said, Cannabis for Cancer, Progress and Promise. And in there, they talked about 15 different kinds of cancer that had responded to cannabis. And there bottom line was the same as everybody's bottom line. We need to do more research. But they were pretty excited about that in 2008, which is a long time ago now.
Yeah. Wow.
So sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, no, that was great. I'm glad that you added that in there. So the last question that we'll ask you, and I thought this was a good one to kind of conclude everything, is somebody wants to know what your thoughts are on the current state of dispensaries and the quality and the training of the bud tenders.
In most states, it's unacceptable. There are some states that require bud tenders to take a few hours worth of training. There's no reason why cannabis shouldn't be treated as medicine, none that I can think of. If you, at the very least, a dispensary should be supervised by a pharmacist. Now, I have to admit, I'm biased. My father was a pharmacist. There are lots of pharmacists in my family. I worked in the drugstore off and on summers and vacations and after school for about 12 years. So I think that pharmacists know something. And I think that bud tenders don't know enough. Is when you go into a drugstore, the clerk will give you, Dr. Sloan's swamp root oil without talking to the pharmacist, but they won't go back in the pharmacy and fill your prescription. That's what we have a pharmacist for. And I think the state of California is behind other states in not requiring bud tenders to be trained, to have a set curriculum, and to not have dispensaries supervised by a pharmacist. I think Arizona said a physician had to supervise the dispensary. I think that's going a little too far, but I don't have a problem with it.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I mean, every dispensary is definitely different. Some, have a lot of turn and there's always like new people at the dispensary. And I do agree that a lot of them don't get a lot of education, but there are some that do invest in their employees and they do training. Green Flower is like a service that we use here at pharmacy, and we have all of our employees that are working with customers take tens of hours of different courses, and we try to do continued education because we are trying to strive to have educated staff. And so if you go to dispensary and if the people aren't able to answer your questions, you can thank them for your time and do your research next time. You can go to different dispensary websites and you can kind of tell if they're like more recreational kind of focused or if they're more medical focused, and usually those that are more medical focused will have a better trained staff. But once you find one, with good staff, usually you can develop like a good relationship and they can help you kind of walk you through the process.
I'm glad I gave you an opportunity to plug your place.
I have to do it at some point. I really am proud of like what we do because I think it is a big problem. And I agree, Normal, an organization that I work for, we offer bud tender training, and we have a lot of people come, that actually work in the industry, and they were never really given that training. So I think it is very important. I agree. And I do think that some of the states that have pharmacists overseeing their programs, that's a good idea, and we'll have to see, what comes down the road for California because we continue to change our regulations. So hopefully in the future, we will have some sort of training program for all these folks.
Good.
Yeah. And even like a statewide education program, some states have been really good, like Colorado, at educating people, to go low and go slow. And I feel like our state in California hasn't really done much as far as public education and safety. So. Right.
It seems to me that one thing that would be useful would be for the state to have a 15-minute show that came on once a week or once a day, so that people are exposed to science. We live in a very strange world. I don't know how many people think the Earth is flat, but there's a lot of people who take a look at the ice melting at the solar poles and say, well, no, there's no global warming, or there's always been global warming. And the science on global warming is something to be concerned about. In my book, Drugs Are Not the Devil's Tools, one of the things I talk about is the Little Ice Age, which was from the 12th century to the early part of the 19th century, in which the average temperature of the Earth went down by 1 degree. And the people who wrote The Little Ice Age think that's why, what's her name, Marie Antoinette lost her head, is that the crops were affected by the average temperature going down by 1 degree. And in that particular year where she said, let them eat cake, there'd been a hailstorm that had knocked the tops off of all the wheat. So there wasn't a heck of a lot of wheat to make bread. So let them eat cake.
Wow. History is tied into everything. And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciated about your presentation is like learning all of those little secrets and details about the history of cannabis. Some people maybe didn't know the full story. So thank you so much for being with us today and sharing all of that information. I feel like I had like a little mini medical history course on cannabis. So this was really great. So thank you once again for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. I enjoyed it.
And thank you to all of our viewers that are watching with us today. And I also want to thank Dr. Bearman's assistant, Amy. She was wonderful in helping put this all together. I hope that we were able to share some information with all of you that will help you become better informed cannabis consumers, and that the information that we provided will help you find relief. Stay well and stay safe, and see you all next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, this was fun.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.